We're going to get started. Welcome. I'm not used to using a microphone when I have everybody that I could just scream to, but since we have as many friends virtually online, I thought I would actually do the right process. So welcome to our third Made in Buffalo event. We're very excited that the Buffalo Jewish Federation continues to offer the community great opportunities to learn about interesting people that grew up or cut their teeth, as we say, in this wonderful community. So thank you all for coming. And I'm not gonna spend much time here. I'm gonna turn this over to Harvey Sanders, who is the heart and soul and idea of bringing Gary Ginsberg home to Buffalo. So Harvey, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Marjorie. As a past president of Temple Beth Tzedek, which is where we all are here today, I want to welcome you to the synagogue. This space here is our, obviously our prayer space, but this is our first kind of COVID in-person big group gathering, and so we really want to welcome you to that. It's wonderful to see you all here today. I welcome everybody on the live stream as well. We're here in conversation, so I do want to encourage folks to save up some questions that you have over the course of the presentation. We've set aside some time at the end, so this really is a conversation. Melissa Brown's going to be kind of facilitating the first part of the conversation. Melissa is the executive director at the Buffalo History Museum. She's been there for 20 plus years. 13 as executive director?
23 years.
23.
Just about.
Yeah, and you and I share the fact that you rebranded the museum.
Yes.
You did some renovation of the museum. You did some fundraising for the museum, and we had to do that on a much smaller scale here for the synagogue. So thank you for coming, and thank you for agreeing to do this. We're really thrilled to have you here. Gary and I grew up at Temple Tzedek, so a predecessor congregation here. And I remember in 1979, I got to the high school, and Gary was the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, and I got to work with Gary on the Tatler, which was the name of the newspaper at Amherst High School. And I'll probably ask you later on, Gary, whether your role as a Tatler editor, bridged your way to writing this book, unless somebody can come up with better questions than that. But I followed Gary to an Ivy League school and to law school in New York City, but from there our paths diverged. I took the far more traditional lawyer career. Gary went into politics and media with George Magazine, with News Corp, and now in June, he sent me an email saying I wrote a book, and I was like, wow, no surprise there, and I was thrilled to read it and thrilled and excited to bring Gary back home for this event. So Melissa, Gary, please.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you, and good evening. Good evening, Gary, and
Melissa.
Welcome guests. My gratitude to the Made in Buffalo Committee for reaching out and extending this opportunity to me. I appreciate the honor of participating and with you, the audience, gaining more insight on the development of your book, your first book. So true to the inspiration for the Federation's Made in Buffalo series, Buffalo, New York is mentioned in the third line of First Friends. How did you come to write this book?
Well, first of all, let me thank Rob and Margie, Melissa, thank you, and Harvey for reading that book so early on and coming up with this idea of bringing me back to Buffalo. It's such a thrill for me to be back here. I left Buffalo more than 40 years ago, but even though I've lived in New York for most of that time, I never really felt like I left Buffalo because I have such a kinship with the city, with the values of the city, with the football team of the city. So you never really feel like you left Buffalo. So for me to come back home is just a really great thrill. Yes, it was the third sentence of my book. I was trying to explain why I wrote this book. And I came up with the idea of writing a book on First Friends in 2018. And people have asked me, well, what was the eureka moment? And I really think it was the product of a series of events that started when I was at Windermere Elementary School as a 9-year-old in the 3rd grade. And for some reason, the 6th grade class, to show the 3rd grade class the importance of the American presidency, did a play about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, why they would think that that's the proper entry point for us to learn about presidents, I'm not quite sure.
It was memorable.
But it was memorable, and I came back from that play absolutely transfixed with this figure of Abraham Lincoln. Oh, sure. So who is this man? Why did this guy, John Wilkes Booth, want to kill him? I couldn't get enough about Abraham Lincoln. I couldn't get enough about the American presidency. My mom, who's sitting right here, fed me that curiosity by bringing me home all kinds of picture books about presidents. It really created this lifelong fascination with the presidency and with politics. And so in 1984, I graduated from college, and I had the chance to work on Gary Hart's campaign. And during that campaign, I watched the role of Gary Hart's best friend, the Hollywood actor Warren Beatty, who would fly in for the most important campaign events. And he would talk to Gary Hart in a way that nobody else on his staff did. He'd say, "Stop talking and acting like a politician, Gary," because he knew some things about stagecraft. And Hart would listen to him in this way that he didn't listen to anybody else, and he would react, in the way that a good friend would, and somebody who was a student of the greatest master of stagecraft. And then I'd watch them go out to dinner, and I'd watch how Warren Beatty, who was his best friend for 12 years, would relax him, would make him laugh, would make him feel give him a respite from the pressures of the campaign trail. So I took note of this friendship, and I thought, wow, what an interesting role to play in a presidential campaign. I saw that same exact dynamic 8 years later when I worked for Bill Clinton in his campaign, and I got to know Vernon Jordan, who was his first friend by 1992, and I watched that same dynamic. Vernon Jordan had equal stature, maybe greater stature than the Arkansas governor, and a lot more star power. And he had the same role with Bill Clinton that Warren Beatty had with Gary Hart. And so I was kind of reinforced with this notion that there's this person around a president, because I saw it played out then during the White House years, who is really unseen, unknown, but can play a really important role both on a substantive level as well as on an emotional level. And I saw in 2018 when I had that eureka moment that Donald Trump didn't have that friend. And what did that mean for his presidency? So I had this idea, and I looked at presidential literature to see what was written about the first friend. And I was surprised because there are books about first wives, first sons, first chefs, first butlers, first decorators, but nothing about this first friend. So I thought, well, I'm going to go dig deep and see if I can find some really good stories about this unique dynamic. And I came up with 9 stories and wrote the book.
Yeah, you definitely found stories when you were digging. And I mean, was it hard to select, to narrow in on those 9?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to find stories that illustrated the sweep of American history. So I wanted to find a friendship from the Founding Fathers era. I wanted to do something in the pre-Civil War era, something for the Civil War, something around the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, and then somebody who was hopefully bridging or in the 21st century. So I was able to do that. I had a lot to choose from. I had probably 15 viable first friend stories, and then as I got deeper and deeper and started writing, there were really 9 that I thought accomplished that illustration of America's history and told, I think, the best stories of the 15 I was looking at.
It seems, and as a person who, certainly in my role appreciates history, presidents can seem larger than life. It struck me that considering presidents through the lens of friendship, their vulnerability and their humanity comes through more. Delving in, let's start with one of the most iconic, President Lincoln and his first friend. Who was Joshua Speed, and how did he get to know Lincoln?
So Abe Lincoln is a brand new lawyer. He's moving to Springfield, Illinois, and he shows up in town because he's got to find some bedding, and he's got to find eventually a place to put that bedding because he doesn't know where he's going to live in Springfield. So he walks into a dry goods store in 1837, and there's a shopkeeper named Joshua Speed who basically owned the store. And he says, "You have any bedding?" And Joshua Speed says, yeah, I do, but it's $17. And Lincoln didn't have a penny to his name. So Joshua Speed recognizes that the guy is broke, but he also has a sense that he knows that he's a politician because Abe Lincoln was then in the Illinois House of Representatives. So he's very smart because he has political ambitions himself. So he says, you know what, go upstairs. I've got a double bed. If you like the bed, it's yours. So Lincoln walks up the stairwell, looks at the bed, puts his stuff down on the bed, walks back downstairs and said, Speed, I moved. And for the next 4 years, Joshua Speed and Abraham Lincoln shared a double bed. It sounds pretty unusual in 2021, but as I learned, if you were a lawyer riding the circuit back in the 1830s, there weren't a lot of Holiday Inns or Marriotts to plop your stuff down. So you would just find whatever you could, and men would often just jump into bed with each other. And so I don't think it was a sexual relationship. I get asked it all the time. How could two men become such intimate friends as they did? They shared everything together. They shared every meal. They shared their fears. They shared their loves. They shared their frustrations, their ambitions. But there was no evidence from any of the correspondence, from any of the people who were around them. And they had a social club in the first floor where the store was every night. And that's where Lincoln kind of learned to tell stories. And he became such a great raconteur in that social club. And none of the men around there thought there was anything sexual about their relationship. But they formed this incredible bond in those 4 years, sharing the bed and becoming such intimate buddies. And the reason why it becomes worthy of my book and becomes so consequential is that in 1841, and you don't really, I didn't know this about Abe Lincoln. Everyone knows that Abe Lincoln had suffered melancholy, but Abe Lincoln was suicidal in the winter of 1841. He had proposed to Mary Todd and then decided he got cold feet. Basically went back to her and said, not so sure I want to do this. The very moment that Joshua Speed says to him, I got to move back to Kentucky. He was the son of slave owners, very successful businessman. His father was a very successful businessman, owned a big plantation. He got sick, and Joshua Speed had to go back to the family plantation. So the twin developments of the broken engagement and his best friend leaving town just sent Abraham Lincoln to his bed. And not just to his bed, but he was ready to kill himself, to the point where he said to Speed, you know, Joshua, if I kill myself, no one will ever know the name Abraham Lincoln. Speed takes all the sharp objects away from him, sits by his side for a month. Abraham Lincoln finally recovers, gets back on his feet, and they maintain their friendship off and on because Speed then goes back to Kentucky. He's a slave owner. And he stays a very unabashed slave owner throughout the 40s, throughout the 50s, while Abraham Lincoln, is getting deeper into politics. Then he becomes a lawyer. Speed himself runs for the Kentucky House, serves one term, but says, I don't want to be a politician, I want to be a businessman. But where it becomes really interesting is, despite their differences on slavery, despite the fact that Joshua Speed was a Democrat, by this point, Abraham Lincoln is a Republican in the late 1850s. When Lincoln becomes president-elect in 1860 in November, one of his first phone calls is to Joshua Speed because he has such a bond that was formed 20 years earlier. And they had maintained this very robust correspondence over slavery in the 1850s. Although they saw each other very infrequently, they stayed very close as pen pals. He calls up Speed and he says, you got to come to Chicago. I need to talk to you. So Speed goes to Chicago. He's in his room. Lincoln comes into his room. He plops on his bed and he says, Speed, what's your pecuniary condition? Speed says, Abe, I'm rich. He says, well, I'm asking you that because I need you to join my administration. Even though we don't agree on all the issues, we are such good friends, I need you in my government. Speed says, I'm not going to join your government, but I'll do something better for you. I'm going to make sure that Kentucky, which was one of the 4 border states in 1860, and remember, in the late fall of 1860, 7 states have already seceded or are about to secede from the Union. Lincoln is about to take office with a completely divided country. If he loses Kentucky and loses those 3 other border states, you've got 11 states now that are fighting the Union. Good chance that you don't keep the Union intact. So Lincoln says, great. Speed goes back to Kentucky. Despite the fact that he was pro-slavery, He does everything he can to make sure that the weapons from the Union militia get into the hands of Union militiamen in Kentucky. He helps Lincoln message the war so that it's not about slavery, but about preserving the Union. He goes up to the White House for Thanksgiving in 1861 and provides really the great respite that every president needs and the solace that every president needs, and stayed great friends with Lincoln throughout his presidency. Kentucky stays in the Union. Obviously, Lincoln wins the war, keeps the Union. And in the middle of this, because of his great friendship with Joshua Speed, he basically, without knowing Joshua Speed's brother that well, appoints him as Attorney General because he says, I know Joshua Speed so well, I have such faith in his brother. So it was just a remarkable friendship that illustrated the two kind of key components that I saw in a first friend. The ability to provide kind of the blunt advice that we all kind of need from our first friends. You know, look, presidents are no different than us, right? And then one of the reasons why I think the book is accessible and resonates is because we can all relate to what our first friends give us. It's, you know, telling us things that we don't necessarily want to hear but need to hear. Recreation, laughter, solace, compassion, empathy, an antidote to loneliness. And then at the same time, you know, a friend can really help you think through problems, can really help you solve problems, can give you that blunt advice, as I said just a minute ago, that you need to hear to make the right decision. And so Joshua Speed, for me, kind of embodied both of those, that great emotional comfort that he gave to Lincoln in the late 1830s and in 1841 when he's ready to kill himself, and that great substantive counsel, as well as respite, as he served as president.
Yeah, it's really remarkable when you think of just how they happen to, you know, their paths cross, and then what, you know, is the residual effect of that.
Yeah.
And thinking of, you know, Lincoln as an iconic president, also, you know, in the founding fathers realm with Jefferson and Madison, they certainly have we come to know them from history book lessons and things. But I was really struck and just drawn right into the book because you spend a significant time talking about the relationship between Jefferson and Madison. And I think really position it as one of the most important friendships in our history. You know, why do you feel that way?
Well, I knew that Jefferson and Madison were great collaborators. I mean, we all know that Madison served as Jefferson's Secretary of State. Madison then succeeds Jefferson as president. What I didn't appreciate was how great friends they were. And we only know that because they exchanged 1,250 letters between them. Imagine that. They were friends for exactly 50 years, from April of 1776 till July of 1826, when Thomas Jefferson dies on that famous July 4th, when Adams dies slightly after him. And throughout that 50 years, they were both great collaborators as well as great friends. They were very different men. Jefferson was 6'3", dashing, larger than life, big idealist, filled a room. Madison was 5'4", timid. He was as practical and kind of exacting as Jefferson was, you know, idealistic and far-thinking. But they needed each other because they were a perfect complement to each other. Jefferson couldn't have been Jefferson without Madison, and Madison couldn't have been Madison without Jefferson. And their friendship plays out over the course of these 50 years. And if you read my chapter, and I won't go into detail because it's excruciating detail, but you'll see that their friendship, I think, resulted in the core structures of the government that we all enjoy today. Jefferson basically feeds Madison all the intellectual capital to write the Constitution. He's in Paris, and he's got access to all the great libraries of Europe. And he's sending him all of these books on philosophy and failed governments and treatises on democracy and republics. And Madison is just this brilliant little guy, is just absorbing it to the point where he becomes the dominant intellectual force in the Constitutional Convention. And it's really through the intellectual sustenance that Jefferson gave him that he was able to write the Constitution that we enjoy today. At the same time, Jefferson writes to Madison afterward and says, you're wrong. You've given far too much power to the central government. We need more power to the people. You need a Bill of Rights. And it was that collaboration that ultimately results in Madison writing the Bill of Rights, which now we, of course, take for granted, but it's so core to the rights we all enjoy. The two-party system, totally a function of their trip upstate in 1791 when they hatched the idea of a rival party to the Federalists, only because of them. The geographic contours of our country, the Louisiana Purchase. Madison was his Secretary of State. Madison was really the genius behind the Louisiana Purchase. And then the state university system that we all enjoy today. After they retired from politics, they went back to Virginia. And together, really Jefferson's kind of the father of the University of Virginia, but Madison was right there in his retirement, side by side, working with Jefferson to create the University of Virginia, which was the first state university in our system. And now we all, we have one right up the street here. So I think it's almost by far the most important friendship in terms of its longevity, in terms of what it left us and what we enjoyed 200 and whatever it is, 30 some years, 40 years later.
Could you share the part, because I was struck by, in understanding the kind of formational history of the country and those tie-ins, that elaborated on, I almost would expect that more, but the part where Madison's heart is crushed.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about that? Because that's just so interesting to think of the founding fathers having a moment like that.
Well, really, that was kind of core to my storytelling. I was to try to find not just these big things that they do together, but what were the small moments where the friendship was so important to each of the friends? Because it wasn't just one way. I mean, that's what was so fun about these chapters. And this was the one example where both friends become president. It's a slight anomaly on the rest of my chapters, but I thought it was worthy of it. But there were two moments. Can I just add the second moment?
Absolutely.
So in 1782, Jefferson is despondent. He's been almost literally run out of the state capitol in Virginia. The British kind of ran him out. His first wife dies. The Virginia legislature is basically put him on trial for abdication of duty. And he gets acquitted, but he's just done. He's like, I don't want to stay in politics anymore. I'm going back to Monticello. I'm just going to retire. Madison says, you are too talented. The country needs you. And so single-handedly goes to the Confederate Congress and says, we got to get Jefferson back in the game. Let's get him to Paris. Let's have him join Franklin and Adams negotiating the peace deal, the peace treaty with the Brits. And so only because of Madison's intervention at that moment did we really have Thomas Jefferson as such a seminal leader of the new government. And then what Melissa's referring to is a year later they're basically boarding together in Philadelphia while Madison is in the Confederate Congress and Jefferson's waiting to go overseas to Paris. And as I said, Madison was this tiny little guy, bald, not a real ladies' man. And he's 32 years old at this point, and he falls in love with a 15-year-old, the daughter of a fellow boarder. And they fall madly in love. They're basically about to get engaged, and then the 15-year-old just jilts him, just like up.
Which in the context of the time, that mortality rates and stuff, the 1532 is like not as unusual.
Right. That's true. It's
just to put that in context.
That's a very good point. But it was Jefferson who really then ministered to him and basically said, you're going to get through this. You're going to find your love. It's going to be okay. And so it's like these tiny moments that to me, I think illustrated that it wasn't just on an intellectual level. It was also on a deeply emotional level as well.
Yeah, that vulnerability. And that retreat theme, like what you explained with Jefferson, that comes up in many of the chapters of the presidents, in the friendships, finding that ability to retreat and regroup, that really does come through.
Well, it's just having witnessed a little bit from a pretty far distance, the pressures that someone like Clinton went through, you can't underestimate how lonely it is, even for the most gregarious of presidents. And they need friends. That's what was so interesting to me is that, they have access to everybody in the world, but at the end of the day, they want people that they have known for a long time, where they have a history with them, where they can feel comfortable and really kind of unburden themselves too.
Definitely.
And
that came through in that theme. You know, I really enjoyed how you distilled the essence of each friendship in the chapter heading, and I was struck by Alone Together in particular, because I feel like it really does capture the essence of the relationship. Featuring the only woman in the book, but who was Daisy Suckley, and how did she get so close to FDR?
So I only have, unfortunately, one woman in the book, obviously not a president, but a friend. Daisy Suckley was FDR's sixth or seventh cousin, depending upon the genealogist you talk to. She was unmarried for the entirety of her life. She spoke 5 languages. Really, really smart woman. She grew up in Dutchess County, basically a neighbor of FDR's. Her family had a lot of money, lost all their money. Roosevelt's kept all their money, or most of their money. And she meets FDR on a dance floor when she's 19, he's 29. She just, is enthralled by this dashing man as he twirls around on the dance floor. Obviously then, as we all know, Roosevelt contracts polio. And it's now 1922. Eleanor's already estranged from FDR. She discovered an affair he had with Lucy Mercer when he came back from the war in 1919. In 1921, Roosevelt gets polio. He's now trying to rehab, and his wife has gone back to New York, and he's up at his estate in Dutchess County. And his mom, just out of the blue, calls up Daisy Suckley, who really didn't know her cousin. Says, would you come over and just keep Franklin company as he works out his body? So she would sit on the Vernon Springwood estate lawn while FDR was literally lifting himself up from a line that he drew to try to build up his upper body. And she'd just sit there and just talk to him. And she provided company at a time when he desperately needed it. And I think there was an attraction between the two. And if you read my chapter, you'll see it plays out in Washington beginning in 1933. They spend a lot of time corresponding after that. He then goes on to become governor, then he becomes president in 1933. He invites her to the White House for his inauguration. And she had been living really by herself with her mother in a dilapidated house. She said, my life is basically in grays. I don't have any color in my life. And suddenly she's invited to the inauguration, and her life just bursts into color because FDR gives her total entree to the White House. He basically dotes on her. He has her come down in 33 and spend a week, just hanging out, having meals with him. So she develops now this, she kind of resurrects her friendship 11 years later, and she becomes a constant companion to the president. And as I write in the book, an antidote to his intense loneliness. You'd think FDR, who's fighting a depression and a world war, would not be a lonely man. But he was intensely lonely because his wife was, off crusading for her causes. His kids largely weren't at the White House. Some were at war. Some just didn't want to be around the White House. So he says to Daisy Suckley at one point, I'm either Exhibit A or left entirely alone. And he didn't want to be left entirely alone. And so he wanted somebody around him whom he felt comfortable with, who made him laugh, who just made him feel whole. I talked to one historian who wrote a number of books about FDR, and he said, FDR would have been a less natural and a less settled president if he didn't have Daisy Suckley in his life. One day he had 22 separate meetings. It was 1944. And I don't know about you guys, but all I'd want to do after 22 separate meetings was go to my bed. All he wanted to do was have dinner with Daisy Suckley. And so I include her. She's the only one that I include of the 9 stories where she didn't play a consequential role in affecting policy. She didn't speak the blunt truth, but she did something just as important, which I thought was important to illustrate in my book, which was that she was the antidote to loneliness. And a president who feels that intense loneliness can't be an effective president. When I asked Hillary Clinton, when I interviewed her for my chapter on Vernon Jordan, I said, what's the most important role of a presidential first friend? And she, without missing a beat, said, respite. Presidents need respite. She said, in the case of Bill, he had Vernon to take him onto the golf course, and that was their respite. For FDR, his respite was hanging out with Daisy and just shooting the breeze and talking about whatever it was he wanted to talk about and having a really sympathetic, interested companion to kind of live those moments with him.
It's come through in other things that I've read that Eleanor really did, because people are like, oh, why would she even tolerate something like that over such a time? But I think they really came to a point where they had an understanding, and there was some mutual benefit, not necessarily even about Sukli, but their own relationship dynamic.
I think
because
so.
she did have her own aspirations.
She had her own aspirations. I think she had her own lover in the White House. She knew that FDR, he had other women in his life. I think she had come to accept it in some kind of begrudging way. I think, by the way, there's one element to the story that I should mention because it's a big part of the chapter, but there was a romantic moment between the two of them in 1935, which I write about, where they go up, they take a drive in Roosevelt's hand-operated car, and they go to the top of a hill, and I think they probably kissed each other, which was, I think, the only kiss in Daisy Sukli's life. They were clearly very attracted to each other, which was part of the energy of that friendship. But I think that was the extent of it. And I asked the eminent FDR historian, Jeffrey Ward, if he thought it was a sexual relationship. And he said, very interestingly, that he thought that after FDR contracted polio, he couldn't have sex. And so he thought that Daisy Sukli died without ever having sexual relations. And so I think it just heightened the value to me of the relationship
As it evolved.
Yeah.
So along that theme with your chapter, kind of capturing that essence, the cost of closeness, that chapter was surprising to me in many ways. First of all, who hasn't read The Scarlet Letter? Speaking of, adultery and relationships, I had no idea that Nathaniel Hawthorne and Franklin Pierce were that close, and probably because you don't spend a lot of time in general history learning much about Pierce.
I didn't know either, to be honest. My father-in-law told me.
You had even said, I think, that of all the first friends, he's probably the only one in the book that's more famous than the president.
By far. Do you know how many Americans can identify Franklin Pierce as a U.S. president? Take a guess. 7%. 7% know that Franklin, and frankly, I'm even astonished at 7%, because he was one of the most unknown presidents in our history. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, we were all, I view it as subjected to Nathaniel Hawthorne's. I was not a big fan of his books. My sister, who's an English professor, chides me for saying subjected, but he's by far more popular today than the president.
How did that friendship get started? Because that's kind of a serendipitous.
Yeah, they end up on a stagecoach going to college together. Pierce was this dashing, at this point he's 19 years old, he's going back for his sophomore year. His father was a Revolutionary War general, grew up in a big house in New Hampshire. There's a tavern on the second floor. He was good looking, athletic, dashing, a little bit like Jefferson. And Hawthorne is a poor kid. The only reason why he goes to Bowdoin is it's the cheapest school that he can enroll in, although he's very smart. But he's basically antisocial. Doesn't say a word on the stagecoach, but there's 4 guys sitting on the stagecoach going up to Maine. And for whatever reason, they're total opposites, a little bit like Jefferson and Madison, they just click. And as soon as they get off that stagecoach, Pierce and Hawthorne become best friends, even though they are totally, totally different.
It was fun to imagine that because you talk about that coach ride and the brisk pace of coming in and then how the friendship evolves. Did Hawthorne actually agree with the views of his friend on the key issue of the day, slavery, which is one of the things I think people do come to know about Pierce and his legacy?
What was so unusual about this friendship is that they're both Northerners. One's living in a literary community in Massachusetts, with Longfellow, Emerson, Thoreau. He's totally pro-slavery. Now, if you want to be the skunk at the garden party, that's the way to do it in the 1840s and 1850s. Pierce was a very successful politician in New Hampshire. His dad was the governor. He was a congressman, then he was a senator, and he's pro-slavery. And it was very unusual for Northern Democrats to be that pro-slavery, be unabashedly pro-slavery. And that's really what caused so much pain in their friendship, because they both held on to their pro-slavery views despite the opprobrium of all of their neighbors, their friends, but they clung together against this kind of torrent of hatred as they each, as Pierce had the most unsuccessful presidency you can imagine. If you read the book, you'll appreciate the tragedy that he and his wife had to endure. They had 3 sons. All 3 sons die before they reach the age of 12. The last one dies 2 months before Pierce takes office. They're taking a train from a funeral, and their 11-year-old son Benny's is in the row behind them. The train derails, and the son gets decapitated right in front of the president-elect and his wife. And the wife never recovers. I mean, you can understand. She's lost 2 sons before. Now she sees her beloved last son decapitated. So she sits in the White House, literally the entire term that he serves, writing letters to her dead son and then crumpling them up and throwing them in a fireplace. Pierce he can't really function as president. He's just so bereaved. But he soldiers through it, but he basically creates the conditions that lead, when he leaves 4 years later, to the Civil War. And that's why he's the first sitting president to not be renominated by his own party for president. So it's a tragic story of a president, both personally and professionally. But he and Hawthorne formed this really incredible bond that is impervious to all the hatred that surrounds them. And in fact, Hawthorne dedicates his last book to Pierce in 1863 when Pierce is long out of office. And his publisher says, do not dedicate your book to Franklin Pierce. No one's going to buy it. He says, I don't care. I'm doing it.
Yeah. The cost of closeness.
That's the cost of closeness. I mean, that was one example. There's many more in the book.
Yeah, that was a really hard chapter. And I didn't know about the loss, with their children. And you reference, I think it's referenced several times in the primary source material that he said, I'm not really up to doing this now. Like he's the president and I'm not really up to the job.
Yeah, it's remarkable that he actually got through it.
So, speaking of that, the serendipitous and looking at the presidency through this lens of friendship, I was also struck by the serendipitous nature by which Eddie Jacobson first met Harry Truman. And I think this particular story, it has a super powerful outcome.
So I said that Jefferson and Madison was the most important friendship. I think the friendship of Eddie Jacobson and Harry Truman has the most consequential moment of friendship in the history of our country, and it's apropos of being in this temple because it affected many of us who love the state of Israel. So these 2 men, not to get to the heart of the story, but these 2 men met in 1903. Harry Truman is a 23-year-old bank teller, and Eddie Jacobson is a 16-year-old son of Lithuanian immigrants, Jews, who fled Lithuania. And his father is a shoemaker. And Eddie Jacobson drops out of high school at 16 because he says that education can't buy bread. And he goes to work for a haberdashery. It's a word I never used before until now. I've used the word haberdashery.
Kind of back in now. There's men's stores that use the haberdashery.
I'm bringing it back.
Come back around, yeah.
So he works for a haberdashery. He's like selling men's clothing, essentially. And he's got to make deposits every day from the store. And who does he go to make deposits in front of? His Harry Truman. So they strike up a friendship. They're 7 years apart, but they become friendly. But they go their own ways for the next 14 years. And just as you say, in terms of serendipitousness, is that a word?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's a hard one. It doesn't roll off the tongue.
Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue. They end up in the same field artillery unit in 1917. Now Truman's
Crazy.
33, or whatever he is, 37 I think he is. And he's the head of the field artillery unit, and Eddie Jacobson is part of his unit. And what's so much fun about this story is that as part of when you head up a unit in 1917, you're in charge of the canteen. Canteen's really important. And so Truman was a farmer at that point. He didn't really know how to run a business. But Eddie did. Eddie had a really good eye for business. And so Eddie completely professionalizes the canteen of the unit to the point where it starts to make real money, and they're able to then provide really good provisions for the members of the unit. And at one point, Truman says, I got this Jew. He's a crackerjack Jew, making me a lot of money in the canteen. So like, they form this bond over their kind of shared, I mean, Eddie's making them look good, basically.
Right.
And they form a really good friendship in the unit. They go over to Europe. They fight in the war, separate battalions, but they're both basically in the same neighborhood where they're fighting. They come back. They get married. They decide, hey, we are really good together as businessmen. Let's open a haberdashery. So they open up a store in Kansas City in 1920. Goes gangbusters for a year. And then in 1921, commodity prices drop, and the store goes bust by 1922. But they stay great friends. And Eddie stays as a haberdasher. Truman, as we all know, goes on to become a judge. Then he becomes a senator from Missouri, becomes a vice president. But every time he'd come back to Missouri, he would always be with Eddie. And they would play poker together. They would hunt together. They would eat meals together. The only thing that Eddie couldn't do was when he went over to where Truman lived, the Wallace home, he couldn't go inside the Wallace home because Truman's wife's family wouldn't let Jews inside the house. They could only be on the porch. But Eddie, it really didn't affect the friendship. I mean, they were just great friends.
They went, they had their own bond clearly, and it's interesting that there's in this relationship, and I think with friends in general, the friend dynamic. Typically, a friend isn't going to necessarily use you for your position. And with the presidency, you could see that could be a slippery slope. And
Yes,
I think,
100%.
In the example of Vernon Jordan and in the example of Eddie Jacobson, they were people who, despite having this friend in this extraordinary position, they never tried to leverage it for their own gains. They truly had a dynamic that was really bound by the friendship and the honor of that. So in Eddie's...
I looked for that. I really did not want to do friendships where there ultimately was a transactional element to it. Because I thought it would devalue.
Because that's not really true.
It's not a genuine friendship, to your point.
Right. So in their relationship, there is a point where Eddie uses his friendship and it changes the course of history.
Right.
So
yeah, right.
That's...
So Eddie, just as Melissa said, he never needed anything from Harry Truman, never asked for anything from Harry Truman. Harry didn't ask anything of Eddie. I mean, it was just a friendship that, just was based on their shared love of each other and shared interests and shared values. But in 1948, something does actually trigger Eddie Jacobson getting on a plane and flying halfway across the country to get something from Harry Truman. And that was his ardent belief that the Jewish people needed a state of their own in 1948. So just to set the context very briefly, Harry Truman had to make a really vexing decision. What do you do about the land of Palestine? Because the British mandate is running out in May of 1948. The UN, if you guys remember, in 1947 had passed this partition plan, which doesn't go anywhere. The Arabs say they don't accept it. The British don't want it. And so by February, March of 48, Truman has got to make a decision about, is he going to support a Jewish state? Is he going to support a UN trusteeship for the land, which means nothing is going to happen? And so by that point, he has basically decided he's not going to do anything. And that's because his Secretary of State, George Marshall, who was the most revered man in America at that point because of what he did in the Second World War, was dead set against the Jewish state. Because he thought that if a Jewish state was declared, it would invite the Soviet Union into the region. It would draw American soldiers back to that region because a war would inevitably break out. Because remember, this is now the beginning of the Cold War. And thirdly, he thought there would be an oil boycott. And that would be ruinous to the economy and ruinous to Truman. He thought that if you have an oil boycott, this is an election year, right? So Truman's got to worry about, how do I get elected to my first real term as president? So he's got the most revered man who's dead set against it. He's got the potentiality of an oil boycott and a war. And then on top of that, he's really frustrated because the Jewish leaders in America were just driving him nuts. They were hectoring him, they were aggressively lobbying him, and he had had enough. He said in a cabinet meeting in February, he said, Jesus Christ couldn't keep the Jews happy during his lifetime, how am I supposed to do it? So by this point, he's just done with the issue. And the reason why that was problematic for Eddie is that there's a guy named Chaim Weizmann who was sitting in New York waiting to come down to Washington to make the key pitch to Truman. Truman knew Weizmann, respected Weizmann. Weizmann was this British scientist who had come up with a way to mass produce acetone, which is the key ingredient for gunpowder. And because of that discovery, it accelerated the end of the First World War. It allowed the Brits to win the war quickly. And so the British government said to Weizmann, as a thank you, what do you want as a reward? And he said, I want a Jewish state in Palestine. And that's where the Balfour Declaration comes from, which I had no idea of until I researched this book. So now you've got Chaim Weizmann sitting in New York. He came across the ocean to make the pitch to Truman because everybody recognized that the Jewish leaders in America had turned him off. He wasn't dealing with the issue. Chaim Weizmann's the key to this. But Truman won't see Chaim Weizmann. So Eddie Jacobson gets a call from New York saying, we know you've never used your friendship with Harry Truman before, but you have to use it now. You've got to get your friend to see Chaim Weizmann because we're not going to get a state. So Eddie writes a note, wires a letter to Truman. Truman writes right back, says, I ain't dealing with it anymore. I'm just tired of the issue. Thanks for your note, but I'm not going to see Chaim, and I'm not going to deal with it. He gets back this wire, and he says, okay, I'm going to get on a plane. Flies halfway across the country, walks up the north driveway of the White House, walks into the appointment secretary office, and he says, hey, Matt, I want to see my buddy Harry. Matt Conley knows he's his best friend. He says, of course, go see Harry. But one thing, do not bring up Palestine. And he goes, of course not. So he walks in. Truman's at his desk. They start making chit-chat, talking about home, talking about, whatever. And finally, Truman says, what are you doing here? Like, why'd you fly halfway across the country? You never asked for anything from me. Why are you standing in front of me? And he says, you got to see Chaim Weizmann. Boom. Sets him off again. Truman goes into a tirade. I mean, it's like a real tirade. I've been disrespected by the Jews. I'm fed up with it. I'm not going to deal with it. Leave me alone. I'm not going to see him. And at that point, Eddie remembers feeling like for the first time in his life, he thought his friend Harry Truman was an anti-Semite. But he's really resolved to not leave that Oval Office with getting what he needs. And he understands the historic import of the moment.
Right.
So he's looking around the Oval Office, and he's trying to find something to get to this man that he's known now for 45 years as a dear friend. And luckily, he kind of looks and finds this mini statue, the statue of Andrew Jackson. Now, in 2021, it's hard to believe that Andrew Jackson would be anybody's hero in life, but Harry Truman idolized Andrew Jackson. He loved his Emersonian spirit, his pioneering spirit, his independence, his willingness to, quote, do what was right. So Eddie says, Harry, you have a hero in Andrew Jackson. I have a hero in Chaim Weizmann. You have to see Chaim Weizmann because if you put yourself in Andrew Jackson's shoes, you know what he would do. He would see him because he would know what's the right thing to do. He would know that you can't be cowed by people who frustrate you. You should overcome this. You should overcome your frustration, your petty frustration, and do what's right. You know you've got to see him. See him. Truman turns around, starts drumming his hands on the desk, looking out at the Oval Office for what seems like an eternity to Eddie Jacobson. He finally turns around and he says, you win, you bald-headed son of a bitch. I'll see him. And 5 days later, he sees Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann makes the pitch that everyone knew that he would make. He convinces Truman of the justness of a Jewish state, of the necessity of a Jewish state at this moment. I think Truman, in fairness to Truman, he was a devout Baptist. He read the Bible. He appreciated the Jewish people's attachment to the land for 2,000 years. So he wasn't completely alien to the importance of the state. But seeing Weitzman, I think, and listening to his beautiful oration, convinced him of the necessity for it. And so sure enough, 11 minutes after the State of Israel was declared in May of 1948, Harry Truman was the first foreign leader to recognize the State of Israel. And thereafter, he always credited Eddie Jacobson as the person who convinced him to do it. And Eddie Jacobson was celebrated in Israel. He was feted there a year later. Some people wanted him to become the first president of Israel. Chaim Weitzman actually was the first president of Israel. And Truman said it was the proudest decision of his presidency, and he credited Eddie Jacobson with it.
That's really powerful.
So it's I think by far the most consequential moment where a friend drew upon the friendship to change history.
I feel like we can go through so many stories, and I still have a lot of questions, but I'm also aware of time, and I know we wanted to get to some audience questions. Before we move into that part, with foreign policy implications, I wanted to touch on the JFK relationship in particular, because that also impacted the course of history. And again, another person that I wasn't really knowledgeable of, but the story for you for that is really in discovering who his first friend was is powerful. So could you speak to that?
Sure. When I was writing this book, obviously I couldn't ask 8 of the 9 presidents who their first friend was, so I had to make a judgment. For the 9th, I was able to ask Bill Clinton, and he had so many friends that he said, I need a few weeks to think about it. For Kennedy, I decided to go to his daughter. I went to college with her brother. I went to law school with her, and she knew I was writing the book, so I said, Caroline, rather than me choose your father's best friend, tell me who you think it is. And she said, I'm going to give you a name you've never heard of. It's going to take you probably 48 hours to figure out that he was really not only my dad's best friend, but my parents' best friend. And then you're going to call me and thank me for it. And she was dead right, because I didn't know who he was. And I had read a lot of Kennedy biographies. So I spent 48 hours digging. There's so little that was just readily available. And then I found it. I had this eureka moment finding this book on the special relationship between Britain and the United States. And I said, oh my God, this is the perfect friendship, because it involved both that emotional side as well as that substantive side. And for me, it was so much fun because it was a complete discovery for me. I knew about Lem Billings. I don't know if many of you may remember the name Lem Billings. If you were around during the Kennedy days, he was he had a room in the White House and went to choate with him, but he didn't really play a substantive role. He was just a raconteur. He loved to play pranks on the president. But this guy, Ormsby Gore, if you read my chapter, was not only the president's best friend, but his most important foreign policy advisor as the British ambassador to the United States.
Unofficial, yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Even to the point where other people were taking notice and upset by that.
Yeah, exactly.
His access.
Right.
And how does that play out then in Kennedy's presidency?
Yeah. Well, they meet in I won't go into the whole history. They meet in 1938 in pre-war London, and they become great friends because they're cut from the same cloth. They're both second sons of powerful fathers. They both talk fast. They're brilliant. They're a little bit lost as to what they're going to do in life. They love to gossip, carouse, play golf, debate politics. So they form this friendship in 1938, and it lasts really uninterrupted up until I'll stop it in 60 because now Kennedy's running for president, and he makes this. I call it a disquieting discovery, which is all of his foreign policy advisors are these fuddy-duddies. He's this new frontier, new kind of candidate, and all of his foreign policy advisors are giving him advice that's kind of conventional and boring to him. So he says, I need David Ormsby Gore to kind of help me message this campaign. So Ormsby Gore becomes kind of his most important foreign policy advisor during the campaign. Where it really plays out, and I didn't know anything about it, was in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's day 5, and he's got to fly back from Chicago to Washington because he's got to make this decision, do I bomb Cuba or do I blockade Cuba, when they discovered the Soviet missiles. So he issues 4 orders of what he's got to do when he gets back to the White House. The 4th order is, I need David Ormsby Gore in the White House before lunch. So Ormsby Gore shows up on day 6, and Kennedy wants to debate the issue just one-on-one with Ormsby Gore. I mean, the future of the world is riding on this decision. And, he's got this whole XCOM, but he needs the advice of the man he trusts the most, and that's this guy, David Ormsby Gore, whom he had been debating with, arguing with, sharing ideas about the nature of leadership for, at that point, 23 years. So they have this total knockdown, drag-out in the Oval Room of the White House about whether to bomb or blockade. They continue it that night, the night before Kennedy goes on TV, and Ormsby Gore basically gives him words to message to the country. 2 nights later, he's back at the White House. They have dinner together, and then Kennedy takes him back to the long gallery, and I write about this at length, and it's Ormsby Gore who basically tells the president how to message to a skeptical public that these missiles really do exist. And he says, we got to release photographs. So the 2 men are literally on the floor looking at photographs of the missile sites, trying to figure out the best pictures to issue to the world so that they will see for themselves that these missiles exist. And then Ormsby Gore, without any instructions from his government, starts talking to Kennedy about what's the perimeter of the blockade. Kennedy says it's 800 miles. And Ormsby Gore is so damn smart. He goes, you're not giving the Soviet captains enough time to think about the implications of breaking a blockade. Move it into 500 miles. So give them an extra 300 miles to turn around before you attack the ships. And Kennedy's like, that's really interesting. And so he calls McNamara. He's like, why is it at 800 miles? And McNamara gives him an answer. He's not at all satisfied with it. He goes, move it to 500 miles. Now, normally, an ambassador cannot make a decision of that import without calling his government and getting instructions from his government to recommend it to the president. It wouldn't happen today. And then, so this goes on for the entire 13 days, such that at one point he's sitting next to Kennedy at an XCOM meeting, and Johnson's sitting at the end of the table, and the door keeps banging on Johnson's chair. And Johnson just goes, what is wrong with this scene? I'm the vice president of the United States. The door to the room is banging on my chair while this British limey is sitting next to the president. He really resented the fact that this guy played such a prominent role. But the Kennedy family loved him. The really smart members of the foreign policy team grew to really appreciate him. And he not only shaped Kennedy's response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he was the intellectual soulmate for Kennedy when he passed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which really ushered the beginning of the end of the Cold War. Without David Ormsby Gore's friendship, we never would have had that first limit on nuclear weapon testing, which started the détente that led to the breakup of really the Soviet Union.
You really do pack so much into each of these relationships and the evolution of them. And we didn't even touch on Rebozo and Jordan yet, but I know we want to open it up to questions. And one thing before we do, and this is a good segue into a Buffalo audience, you didn't talk about any of the Buffalo presidents. Is there a reason you steered clear of them?
Well, I looked at Grover Cleveland. I didn't really know anything about Grover Cleveland. I used to play at the Grover Cleveland golf course growing up. Not much of a golf course, but it was there. And I looked into his life, and he has this crazy first friendship with this guy Folsom, Oscar Folsom.
Oscar, yeah.
And I mean, it's sordid. It's as sordid a story of friendship as you're going to find. And I recommend. There's a great book about this scandal, which it's scandalous even by 21st century standards. I didn't do it because Oscar dies before Grover Cleveland becomes president. I really wanted to show the impact of the friendship on the president. So as fun and as scandalous as that story was and could have been for my readers, I wanted to stay true to the concept of the book.
Sure.
Lord Fillmore, I didn't even look at him, actually.
No, I feel like that's the way that's the way the history has been for Millard Fillmore. I we have actually the piece of Grover Cleveland's wedding cake in the collection to Frances Folsom, who was Oscar Folsom's daughter. It was a May-December romance for sure, but it's the only marriage in the White House.
Yeah.
And there were Buffalonians that had gone, and that's how the cake
That's
comes
wild,
back
yeah.
to us. So let's open it up to some questions, Harvey.
Sure. Start with Larry.
Thank you for writing such a wonderful book, interesting chapters, different tidbits, good writing style, excellent structure. Really enjoyed it. Question I have today is perhaps topical. Who is President Biden's best friend, if we know one?
Yeah. I finished the book about 15 days before Biden was sworn in, so I couldn't do Biden. But I really wanted to know the answer to that question, so I asked a lot of people who are close to Biden, and everybody to a person said his name is Ted Kaufman. So I reached out to Ted Kaufman and ended up, I talked to him a lot now. He's a wonderful man. And Ted Kaufman was Joe Biden's chief of staff for 22 years, from 1973 to 1995. But he not only was his chief of staff, he also was a neighbor in Wilmington. So he would ride the Amtrak up and back every single day that they were working in session. And he got to become not just a colleague, but a great friend. And just to give you one illustration of how close they are, and Ted wouldn't tell me anything. I mean, he's so modest. He's such a decent human being. And by the way, when Biden became vice president, he had to give up his Senate seat. And he turned it over to Ted Kaufman, who was long gone from his office, but that just gives you a sense of how close he was. In 2015, Beau Biden is dying. It's April of 2015. And Joe Biden does not want to be alone without his best friend. So he calls up Ted and he says, will you take a 120-day non-paid special governmental employee designation and come to Washington and just be here? And without missing a beat, Ted gets on that Amtrak, paperwork gets done, gets there the next day. They give him an office in the executive office building, and he just sat there for the next 4 months while Biden went through his son's death, his burial. And as I heard from friends, Biden would often go just wander across the West Executive driveway into Ted's office and just sit there and just sit there and talk to him and just feel comforted by him. Ted would go across to his vice presidential office, the West Wing. They spent so many hours at meals at night together. And Ted Kaufman really kind of nursed him back to health, emotional, mental health, as a result of his son's death. And that to me was just such a beautiful example of this incredible now 50-year friendship. And I asked Ted, I said, listen, because I talk to him all the time. In fact, I called him up and I said, was it the lack of a first friend around Biden that caused the horrible Afghanistan withdrawal? And he said, you know, Gary, the decisions are so complex today that I don't feel qualified to opine on any of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And if Joe calls me and asks me for something, I say, Joe, unless I'm with you in the Oval Office or in the West Wing, I don't want to give you advice like this. Because by the time it reaches the president's desk, that means that 5,000 other people couldn't make a decision. So he's just such a modest man that he does not want to get involved in substance right now. So I found really interesting.
Definitely.
Thank you. How could I not be at a night called First Friends? Because
One of my first friends in life.
Gary and I met each other at kindergarten Hebrew school at Starin when we were 5. And to this day, if I send him a text, he texts me back. Although we've never shared a queen bed together.
We never shared. It wasn't even queen, it was a double bed.
They didn't even have those.
I just wanted to say thank you for being a first friend. I know, I would too. We're so proud of you. So thank you very much for coming back here and for always being a great friend.
Oh, thank you. I feel the same way.
Can I move my mask down? I think you're fabulous, okay? My second home is in Florida, and I'm involved in the Jewish Federation. My first love here is Buffalo, and my second love is my community in Palm Beach Gardens, which is called Mirasol. So I was wondering if you would come and speak to us for Jewish Federation, if you're making the tour, if we invite you.
I'd be delighted to.
Okay.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Because
Be
I'm
honored.
so fascinated. You stole my heart. I just think you're unbelievable, both of you. And you did an incredible job. Thank you so much. I just can't thank you enough. And I'm so glad I was here.
I'm going to steal the mic back and wrap up our official time here. We have goodies out in the lobby for those of you, sorry folks on the virtual setting, for you to have and stick around and schmooze with Gary and Melissa. I also want to acknowledge the Buffalo Presidential Center is here with the display in the lobby as well, so please stop by and talk to Bren. It's a really cool place that's housed in the Buffalo Library, and they have quite a collection of presidential memorabilia. So we're happy that they, along with the Buffalo History Museum, has helped Buffalo Jewish Federation bring this great talk to you tonight. So if you have questions to follow, please don't be shy, but thank you all for coming, and have a great evening.
That
so
was,
much. That was really great.
wonderful.
Really enjoyed
I
it.
could talk to you all night.
Mark, can I get a picture of the two of you and take out your mask?
Oh, sure.
If you get with Harvey. Yes, I can get Harvey in there. And how about your mom?
Sure.